They told me the king was dying and that only the tallest, strongest blood could save the dynasty. My name is Margaret of Lancaster, and I became Queen of England at 19 years old when I married King Henry VI in 1445. I was chosen for my Plantagenet bloodline, my political connections to powerful French nobility, and my youth that promised decades of childbearing ahead. My purpose was clear and absolute: provide England with a strong male heir to secure the succession and prevent the Wars of the Roses from tearing the kingdom apart. But my husband was frail beyond remedy, weakened by inherited illness that left him barely able to walk, prone to fits of madness, and completely incapable of fathering children. By 1450, with England descending into civil war and rival claimants gathering armies, Henry made a desperate decision that would destroy and remake 3 lives forever. The king was withering away, his body failing rapidly. He needed a giant to father the son his broken body could never produce. He plucked a peasant from the mud, a massive farmer from the villages who stood nearly 7 feet tall. The queen recoiled in absolute disgust. "He is dirty, filthy, covered in mud and peasant stench," I protested. "But he is tall," the king replied with cold pragmatism, "and he is fertile and strong. Give me a son, Margaret. Give England the heir we desperately need, or watch the kingdom burn." This is the story of how a dying king's brutal command, a horrified queen's forced compliance, and a peasant giant's unexpected dignity created the most scandalous royal birth in English history, and how the prince born from that dark arrangement would eventually end the Wars of the Roses and force England to confront the terrible price of dynastic survival. Let me take you back to 1445, to the day I arrived in London as a bride, completely unprepared for the nightmare awaiting me. The Kingdom of England was in crisis, torn between the houses of Lancaster and York in an escalating conflict that would eventually be called the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI was 23 years old when we married, King of England and nominal King of France, descended from the great warrior Henry V, who had conquered half of France but whose son had inherited none of his strength or capability. I was 19, daughter of René of Anjou, educated in French courtly arts, and raised to understand that my marriage would be political alliance first, and personal relationship never. The wedding was spectacular, held in Westminster Abbey with all the pageantry England could muster despite the ongoing war expenses. I wore cloth of gold and a crown of pearls, looking every inch the queen I was supposed to become. Henry was handsome enough in his ceremonial robes, tall and thin with the distinctive Plantagenet features, dark hair and pale skin. He smiled at me during the ceremony, a gentle, confused smile that should have warned me something was deeply wrong, but I was too young and naive to recognize the signs. The wedding night revealed the horrifying truth about the man I'd married and the impossible situation I'd entered. Henry came to my chambers as tradition required, dismissed the witnesses who'd observed us getting into bed together, and then sat on the edge of the mattress staring at his hands and trembling. "Margaret," he said without looking at me, "I must tell you something before you discover it yourself and think I've deceived you intentionally." "What must you tell me, Your Majesty?" "I am unwell, very unwell. I have fits where I lose all awareness of my surroundings, sometimes for hours. I have weakness in my limbs that makes walking difficult. I have pain throughout my body constantly. And he gestured vaguely downward, I cannot perform the marriage act. My body does not respond as it should. The physicians say it's related to my other ailments, all stemming from bad blood inherited from my French grandfather who went mad." I stared at him, trying to process this confession. "You're telling me you're impotent, and ill in other ways as well?" "Yes. I should have told you before the marriage, but my advisors insisted that revealing this would prevent the alliance and leave England even more vulnerable, so they arranged the marriage first, and now I'm telling you the truth you deserve to know." "I'm sorry, Margaret. You deserved better than to be deceived into marrying a broken king." The cruelty of the situation was staggering. I was 19 years old, just married, and being told by my husband that he was mentally and physically incapable of fulfilling any aspect of marriage. But what about children? What about the heir everyone expects? We'll pretend to be attempting conception. When no pregnancy occurs, we'll blame various causes, perhaps your barrenness or God's will or anything except the truth about my condition. My advisors assure me that as long as we maintain appearances, the kingdom will remain stable enough. And if we can't maintain appearances, If the lack of heir creates succession crisis, then we'll address that when it comes. For now, we simply pretend everything is normal and hope the situation somehow improves or resolves itself. He left me alone in that bed, and I spent my wedding night crying into silk pillows in a palace that had just revealed itself as an elaborate trap. Over the next year, I came to understand the full extent of Henry's illness. He had periods of complete mental breakdown where he would stare at nothing for hours or days, unable to speak or recognize anyone. He had physical weakness that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. He had seizures that terrified everyone who witnessed them. And through it all, he remained completely incapable of fathering children, his body unresponsive to any attempts at intimacy. The physicians tried everything: potions and herbs, dietary changes, bloodletting, prayer, even imported remedies from foreign doctors. Nothing worked. Henry's condition was inherited, genetic, beyond any medical intervention available in the 15th century. By 1448, 3 years into our marriage, the political pressure became unbearable. England was losing the war in France, noble families were choosing sides between Lancaster and York, and everyone blamed the instability on the lack of a clear heir. Henry's cousin Richard of York began making increasingly bold suggestions that if the king remained childless and incapacitated, perhaps someone more capable should rule instead. The king's advisors, led by the Duke of Somerset, began pressing me privately about the succession problem. "Your Majesty," Somerset said during one particularly uncomfortable private meeting, "the kingdom cannot continue indefinitely without an heir. The king's condition makes natural conception impossible. We must consider alternative arrangements." "What kind of alternative arrangements?" "The kind where you conceive a child with someone else, present that child as the king's legitimate heir, and secure the succession before York's faction gains enough power to challenge us militarily." "You're suggesting I commit adultery and pass off a bastard as legitimate heir to the throne?" "I'm suggesting you save England from civil war through whatever means necessary." The king himself has agreed to this plan. He understands his limitations and accepts that extraordinary measures are required. I don't believe Henry would agree to such a thing. Ask him yourself. We did, and to my shock, Henry confirmed it. "Margaret," he said weakly from his bed where he'd been confined for 2 weeks with one of his episodes, "I know this is monstrous to ask of you, but I'm dying slowly, and I cannot give you children naturally. Somerset is right that we need an heir urgently. If you conceive a child with another man and we claim it as mine, no one can prove otherwise. The child will be legally legitimate, and the succession will be secured. Who would father this child? How would we even arrange such a thing? Somerset has been researching options. We need someone strong and healthy to maximize the chance of producing a robust heir. Someone who can be completely controlled to ensure permanent silence. Someone whose social position makes claiming the child impossible." The Duke returned with his recommendation 2 weeks later. I'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it was coming but hoping somehow it could be avoided. "Your Majesty," Somerset began, "we've identified the ideal candidate for this arrangement. Someone who possesses all the qualities we need. Who is it?" "Some nobleman you think can be trusted." "No, a peasant from the villages outside London. A farmer named Thomas Blackwood, who's known throughout the region for his extraordinary size and strength. He stands nearly 7 feet tall, can plow fields faster than any 3 normal men, and is apparently quite fertile based on the numerous children he's already fathered in his village." "You want me to conceive a child with a peasant? A common farmer?" "Yes. His size and obvious health will produce a strong heir. His low social position means he has no ability to claim the child or threaten the succession later. His poverty means he can be controlled with money and threats. And his lack of education means he's unlikely to understand the full political implications of what we're arranging, making him easier to manage. This is insane. I'm the Queen of England. I cannot be bred like livestock with some muddy peasant." "You can and you will," Somerset said with cold authority. "The king has commanded it. I've commanded it on his behalf since he's currently unable to speak coherently. And you'll cooperate fully, or we'll proceed with a different arrangement where your consent is even less relevant." "Is that a threat?" "It's a clarification of reality. You exist to produce heirs. If you won't do so voluntarily under these special circumstances, we'll ensure it happens anyway, and your life afterward will be significantly less comfortable. Now, Thomas Blackwood will be brought to the palace tomorrow. You'll be given time to meet him briefly, and then the breeding arrangement will commence immediately. We cannot afford further delay. I had no choice, no real power despite my title. I was queen in name only, a vessel for producing heirs, and now I was being commanded to conceive with a peasant farmer because my husband's broken body couldn't perform the task. They brought Thomas to the palace the next morning, and my first sight of him confirmed every worst fear about this nightmare arrangement. He was absolutely massive, at least 6 feet 10 inches tall, with shoulders like an ox and arms thick with muscle from years of farm labor. He wore his working clothes, rough wool tunic and breeches that were stained with mud and smelled of animals and fields and honest labor that I found revolting in my perfumed, refined court environment. His hands were enormous and calloused, more like tools than human appendages. His face was weathered from sun exposure, with a thick brown beard and dark eyes that darted around the palace nervously, clearly overwhelmed by his surroundings. His hair was long and unkempt, tied back carelessly. He looked exactly like what he was, a peasant farmer suddenly dragged into a world he didn't understand and couldn't navigate. Somerset presented him to me in a small receiving room, with guards stationed outside. "Your Majesty, this is Thomas Blackwood." Thomas bowed to the Queen. Thomas bowed awkwardly, nearly losing his balance, clearly unfamiliar with court protocol. He kept his eyes on the floor and said nothing. "Has he been told why he's here?" I asked Somerset coldly. "He's been given basic explanation, that he's to provide stud service for the royal line due to the king's illness, that he'll be rewarded handsomely for cooperation and executed for refusal or any breach of secrecy. He understands the stakes." I studied Thomas, this massive peasant who represented everything I found disgusting about this arrangement. He's filthy, covered in dirt, and he smells like a barn. Can't he at least be cleaned properly before whatever you're planning? "He's been washed already," Somerset replied. "What you're smelling is just the natural scent of someone who works outdoors. It won't affect his ability to perform the required function. I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can allow this man to touch me. You don't have a choice, and neither does he." Somerset gestured to the guards. "Take Thomas to the prepared chamber. The Queen will be brought there this evening after final preparations. This is monstrous. This is survival." Somerset's voice was ice. "And you'll both do your duty to England whether you like it or not." They took Thomas away, and I was left alone to contemplate the horror of what was coming. That evening, after being examined by physicians and given fertility herbs, I was taken to a chamber in a remote wing of the palace. It was furnished minimally, a bed, a fireplace, a table and chairs, clearly set up specifically for this purpose, and isolated enough that no courtiers would witness what was happening. Thomas was already there when I arrived, standing near the window looking lost and terrified. He'd been cleaned more thoroughly and given fresh clothing, simple but clean, though he still carried that scent of outdoors and labor that I found so repellent. Somerset had accompanied me to the chamber door. "Your Majesty, the situation is simple. You will remain here with Thomas until conception is confirmed. That may take one night or several. Food will be brought daily. Physicians will check periodically. Neither of you will leave until pregnancy is established. Do you both understand?" "I understand that I'm being forced into this against every instinct of dignity and propriety I possess," I said bitterly. "Thomas, do you understand?" Thomas finally spoke, his voice deep and rough with a thick rural accent that marked him as uneducated peasant stock. "Aye, my lord. I understand I'm to give the Queen a child because the king cannot, and that I'll be killed if I speak of it or refuse." "Good. Then proceed with the task at hand." Somerset left, locking the door from outside. Thomas and I stood in that chamber, separated by enormous gulfs of social class, education, and mutual revulsion at the situation we'd been forced into. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to look at him directly, this massive peasant who represented my complete degradation, the final proof that despite my title and crown, I was just property to be used however men decided. Finally, Thomas spoke hesitantly. "Your Majesty, I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "What do you mean?" "They told you clearly enough. I mean, I don't know how to talk to you or behave around you. You're the Queen. I'm just a farmer. I've never even seen nobility up close before yesterday. Everything about this is terrifying and wrong, and I don't know how to make it less terrible. At least we agree it's terrible," I said coldly. though probably for different reasons. You're disgusted because you're being forced to do something difficult. I'm disgusted because I'm being forced to allow a muddy peasant to touch me." Thomas flinched as if I'd struck him. Your Majesty, I understand I'm beneath you in every way. I'm sorry my presence offends you. I'm sorry I'm not clean enough or refined enough for your standards. I'm sorry I'm just a farmer who smells like work instead of perfume. But I didn't choose this any more than you did. They came to my fields yesterday, told me the king needed my service, and dragged me here with threats of execution if I refused. So I'm here trying to survive this impossible situation just like you are, even if you think I'm too dirty to deserve basic human consideration." The unexpected eloquence and dignity in his response startled me. I'd assumed he was just a stupid peasant, too ignorant to understand or feel anything complex. But his words revealed someone more thoughtful than I'd given him credit for. I apologize," I said stiffly. "That was needlessly cruel. This situation isn't your fault any more than it's mine. We're both being used by the Duke of Somerset and the other advisors who care only about producing an heir regardless of the cost to either of us." Thomas moved carefully to one of the chairs and sat, the furniture creaking under his massive weight. "May I speak honestly, Your Majesty? Since we're trapped here until this terrible thing is accomplished, perhaps honesty serves us better than pretense." "Speak then." "I'm terrified. More terrified than I've ever been. I'm a simple farmer. I grow crops, I raise animals, I provide for my family. Yesterday I was in my fields working, and today I'm in a palace being told to father a child on the Queen of England. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be with someone so far above my station. I don't know how to touch royalty without causing offense or harm. And I'm afraid that no matter what I do, I'll be executed afterward because I know too much." "You think they'll kill you even if you cooperate?" Thomas looked at me directly for the first time, his dark eyes holding unexpected intelligence. "Your Majesty, I'm a peasant who will know the truth about the royal heir's parentage. I'm a threat to the succession just by being alive. Of course they'll kill me once I've served my purpose. They'll dress it up as an accident or attribute it to some crime. But I'll be dead within weeks of leaving this palace. I know that, and I've accepted it. I just hope they'll leave my wife and children alone and perhaps give them the money they promised." "You have a wife and children?" "A wife named Emma and 4 children, ranging from age 8 down to 10 months. They're the reason I agreed to this. Somerset promised them enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives if I cooperated. So I'm here, about to betray my marriage vows to save my family financially before these nobles kill me for knowing too much." The crushing weight of the situation pressed down on both of us. He was right. Somerset would absolutely have him killed once pregnancy was confirmed, and his wife and children would be left with blood money and a dead husband whose absence would be attributed to some convenient accident. The cruelty was staggering. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Sorry that you've been dragged into this. Sorry that your reward for cooperation will be execution. Sorry that your family will be left without you. You deserve better than to be used and discarded like a tool. As do you, Your Majesty. You deserve better than to be bred like livestock because your husband is ill. You deserve choice and dignity and respect. But neither of us has those things. So perhaps what we can do is try to make this bearable for each other. Try to preserve what small dignity remains in an inherently undignified situation." We sat in silence for a long time. Finally, I asked, "Tell me about your family, your wife and children. What are they like?" Thomas's face softened. "Emma is strong and kind. She's a weaver, makes beautiful cloth that she sells in the village. We married young, both of us 16, and we've been happy despite poverty and hard work. Our eldest is John. He's 8 and already helping in the fields. Then Mary, who's 6 and loves singing. Then little William, who's 3 and gets into everything. And baby Catherine, who's not yet walking but who smiles all the time. They're everything to me, Your Majesty. The reason I work from dawn to dusk, the reason I agreed to this nightmare arrangement. If my death and your disgust means they'll live well, then I can bear it. Do you love your wife? More than anything. She's my partner in everything. My best friend, the mother of my children. Betraying her like this, even under royal command, feels like dying. But I tell myself I'm doing it to protect her and our children. And that makes it bearable. The contrast with my own loveless political marriage was stark and painful. This peasant farmer had something I'd never experienced: genuine partnership and affection in marriage. He was sacrificing that real love for his family's survival, while I was being forced to violate a marriage that had never been real to begin with. We talked through the evening, sharing pieces of our lives across the vast social divide. Thomas told me about farming, about planting cycles and harvest challenges, about the satisfaction of growing food and seeing your labor produce tangible results. He told me about village life, about community festivals and shared hardships, about the way peasants supported each other through difficulties because they had nothing else. I told him about court politics, about the constant scheming and faction battles, about feeling like a pawn in games played by men who saw me as merely a breeding vessel. I told him about Henry's illness, about the guilt and frustration of being unable to help my husband while also resenting him for the situation his weakness had created. Gradually, slowly, something like mutual understanding developed. Not attraction or affection. The social gulf was too vast and the situation too horrible for that. But recognition that we were both human beings trapped by forces beyond our control, trying to survive with what dignity we could maintain. Finally, deep into the night with both of us exhausted, Thomas said quietly, "Your Majesty, we must address what we've been avoiding all evening. I know, but I don't know how to proceed with this. My husband's illness means I've been married 5 years, but I'm still essentially untouched. And now I'm supposed to conceive with you. And I don't know how to begin." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I've been with my wife many times, obviously, given our 4 children. But she's my wife, my equal, someone I love and who loves me. You're the queen, infinitely above me, someone who finds my presence revolting. I don't know how to be gentle with someone who's disgusted by me." "I don't find you revolting as a person," I said, surprised by my own honesty. "I find the situation revolting. I find being forced to do this revolting. But you've been more kind and thoughtful than I expected. More than I probably deserve given how cruel I was earlier. You're not what I expected when they told me I'd be breeding with a muddy peasant. What did you expect? Someone stupid and brutal. Someone who'd hurt me because he could and because he wouldn't understand or care about my fear. Instead, I find someone intelligent and thoughtful who clearly does care, who's trying to make this bearable despite knowing it will cost him his life. You're making this harder by being decent, Thomas. It was easier when I could just hate you as the instrument of my degradation. I'm sorry for being decent then." His voice held a hint of very gentle humor. "Perhaps I should be cruel and brutish to make this simpler for you. No, stay decent, stay kind. If this horror must happen, I'd rather it happen with someone who treats me like a person rather than just a vessel to be filled. Can you do that? Can you be gentle even though I'm royalty and you're terrified and this whole situation is impossible?" "I can try, Your Majesty. I can't promise it won't hurt given your inexperience and my size, but I can promise I'll be as careful as I know how to be. I'll move slowly. I'll stop if you ask me to, even knowing it might mean we both die for failing the Duke's command. You deserve at least that much choice in a situation where you have almost none. Why? Why risk your life and your family's future to give me choice I technically don't have? Because taking away someone's dignity just because you're forced to hurt them makes you a monster. I can be forced to do this terrible thing to you, but I don't have to do it cruelly. Preserving your dignity preserves my own. It's the only power I have in this whole nightmare, the power to choose gentleness over brutality. So I choose gentleness because that's the only way I can remain human." His words moved me in ways I didn't expect. Here was a peasant farmer showing more moral sophistication than most of the nobles I'd known. What happened next, I will describe only minimally, because some experiences remain too private and painful for detailed recounting. Thomas kept his promise about gentleness. He was extraordinarily careful, treating me with a reverence I'd never experienced, constantly checking if I was comfortable, if the pain was too much, if I needed him to stop. His size made everything difficult and frightening, but his care and patience were absolute. When it was finished, I lay in the bed crying while Thomas moved to the far corner of the room, sitting on the floor with his back to me to give me privacy in my grief. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "Your Majesty, I'm so sorry. You did nothing wrong. You were gentle. You were kind. The wrongness isn't in how you acted, but in the fact that this is happening at all. I understand. But I still feel like I've violated something sacred. You're the queen. I'm just a farmer. I had no right to touch you even under royal command, and I'll carry that wrongness for however many days I have left to live. In the morning, Somerset's physicians came to examine me, confirmed that we'd fulfilled the command, and left. Guards brought food, but no other interaction. Thomas and I were to remain together, meeting like this every other day until conception was confirmed. Neither of us could leave the palace. The arrangement continued for 3 weeks, 6 more commanded encounters. Each one became slightly less terrifying as familiarity replaced raw fear, though the fundamental wrongness never diminished. Between these meetings, Thomas and I talked extensively, building something like genuine friendship across the social divide. He told me more about his life and dreams, about wanting to save enough money to buy his own land instead of farming as a tenant, about hoping his children would have opportunities for education and advancement beyond what he'd had. I told him about the loneliness of royal life, about feeling trapped by position and expectation, about envying peasants their freedom to make choices even if those choices were only between different types of hardship. In our final meeting, something shifted. We'd been talking for over an hour when Thomas said something that made me genuinely laugh. A joke about one of his chickens who kept escaping the coop and had to be outsmarted. The laughter felt transgressive, wrong. How could I find humor in this situation? But Thomas smiled at the sound. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh, Your Majesty. It's a good sound. You should laugh more, even in terrible circumstances. How can I laugh when my life has become this nightmare? How can I find any joy in being used for breeding? Your life is being controlled but not destroyed if you refuse to let it break your spirit completely. I've lost my freedom and likely my life soon. My wife doesn't know where I am or why I disappeared. My children think I abandoned them, but I still choose to find small moments of humanity in the horror. Laughing with you, talking about chickens and crops and life beyond these terrible circumstances, that keeps me human. I can be a victim, or I can be a survivor who maintains dignity. I choose survival and dignity even when it's hard. You're stronger than I am," I said quietly, "or I've had more practice surviving impossible situations. Peasants learn early that life is often brutal and unfair. The only choice is how we respond. I see strength in you too, Your Majesty. You survive with grace even when you have every right to collapse or rage. That's profound strength." The conversation marked a turning point. I began seeing Thomas not as the instrument of my violation, but as a fellow victim trying to maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. Something like real respect developed, maybe even the beginning of actual friendship forged in shared suffering. In late December of 1450, my monthly courses failed to appear. The physicians examined me and delivered their verdict. "Your Majesty, you are with child." The news reached Somerset immediately. The plan had worked. I was pregnant with what he hoped would be a strong, healthy heir to save the Lancaster succession. Within days, he arranged for Thomas to be accidentally killed. Guards told me Thomas had fallen from a palace wall while being moved to different quarters, dying instantly from the fall. They assured me his family would receive the promised payment. I knew it was murder disguised as accident, but I had no power to prevent it or even acknowledge the truth. I requested permission to say goodbye to Thomas's body before burial, and Somerset surprisingly agreed, perhaps feeling magnanimous now that his plan had succeeded. They took me to a small chapel where Thomas's massive body lay prepared for peasant burial. I stood looking down at him, this gentle giant who'd been forced into my life and then murdered for knowing too much, and I wept openly. "I'm sorry," I whispered to his still form. "Sorry for everything. Sorry I was cruel when we first met. Sorry you were used this way. Sorry your reward for gentleness was death. Sorry your family lost you. Thank you for being kind when you could have been brutal. Thank you for treating me like a person rather than just a vessel. Thank you for maintaining your dignity and helping me maintain mine. I'll make sure your child knows eventually that their biological father was a good man who deserved better than the fate he received." I carried the baby through winter and into spring of 1451. The pregnancy was healthy, and Henry, during his rare lucid periods, played his role as expectant father for court appearances. My formal story was that the king and I had finally managed successful conception before his latest bout of illness. In May of 1451, I gave birth. A son, enormous and healthy, weighing nearly 13 pounds. The physicians placed him in my arms, and I looked down at my baby for the first time. He was beautiful, perfect, and he looked nothing like Henry. The child had Thomas's dark hair and eyes, his broad features, his large bone structure. Even as a newborn, he clearly carried peasant farmer blood rather than refined plantagenet characteristics. But no one dared acknowledge what they saw. This was the heir, born to the queen and acknowledged by the king, and therefore legitimate regardless of appearance. Henry came to see us, supported by attendants because his illness had worsened significantly. He looked down at the baby and I saw him register the obvious differences from royal bloodline, but he smiled weakly. "My son," he said for the attendants to hear, "Prince Edward of Lancaster. May he be strong where I was weak, healthy where I was ill, and capable of ruling where I could not." The christening occurred 3 weeks later in Westminster Abbey. Edward was proclaimed heir to the throne and celebrated throughout England as proof that God still favored the Lancaster line. The Civil War didn't end immediately. York's faction continued challenging Henry's rule, but having an heir stabilized the succession enough to keep Lancaster supporters unified. Edward grew rapidly, displaying his biological father's extraordinary size and strength from earliest infancy. By age 1, he was walking and showing remarkable physical coordination. By age 3, he was notably larger and more robust than other children his age. And always he looked like Thomas. The resemblance was undeniable to anyone who'd known both the peasant farmer and the prince, but the court maintained collective fiction. This was pure Lancaster blood with perhaps some unusually strong characteristics from the Queen's Angevin ancestry. I raised Edward with fierce protective love and constant underlying grief. Every time I looked at him, I saw Thomas, the gentle farmer who'd tried to preserve my dignity in the midst of violation, who'd been murdered for giving this child life. When Edward was 7, I told him a simplified version of the truth. We were in the royal gardens, and he'd asked why he didn't look like his father, the king. "Sweetheart," I said carefully, "King Henry is your father-in-law and in his heart, but your blood father, the man who actually gave you life, was a very strong, good man named Thomas who died when you were a baby. Why did I have a different blood father? Because King Henry was very ill and couldn't give me children the normal way. So Thomas helped us by giving me you, and then he died protecting that secret so you could be safe as the prince." Was he a knight? Was he noble like father? He was a farmer, actually, a peasant from the villages, but he was noble in the ways that matter most. He was kind and gentle and brave, and he gave you his strength and his good heart along with his blood. Edward absorbed this thoughtfully. "So I'm part peasant? Part common?" "Yes. Half your blood is common farmer stock. And I want you to remember that always, Edward. You're not just royal privilege. You're also common people, common strength, common goodness. You bridge two worlds that are usually kept separate, and that's your greatest advantage." As Edward grew older, I told him more complete truth in age-appropriate stages. By age 12, he understood the forced nature of my arrangement with Thomas, and the fact that Thomas had been murdered to protect the secret. By age 15, he knew the full story of dynastic desperation, peasant dignity, and noble cruelty. By age 18, he'd integrated this knowledge into a coherent identity that honored both his royal position and his common blood. Edward became known as Edward of Westminster, and later as Edward the Strong. He never technically became king because Henry lived far longer than expected, clinging to life and throne until 1471. But Edward was the real power behind the Lancaster cause during the Wars of the Roses, commanding armies with skill that amazed everyone, and showing physical courage that inspired loyalty. He was everything Henry wasn't: strong, decisive, capable, healthy, and he fought to preserve Lancaster rule with a ferocity that suggested he knew his very existence was what made that rule possible. In 1471, at age 19, Edward was killed in battle at Tewkesbury fighting for the Lancaster cause against York forces. His death effectively ended Lancaster hopes, and the York line eventually took permanent control as the Tudor dynasty. But Edward had given Lancaster 14 years of viable succession, and had nearly won the Civil War multiple times through his military brilliance. I outlived both Henry and Edward, dying in 1482 at age 56. The Wars of the Roses continued after my death, eventually ending when Henry Tudor combined Lancaster and York claims through marriage. But the crisis had been delayed significantly by Edward's existence, and England had been given time to develop political structures that made the eventual Tudor peace possible. In my final years, I commissioned a small private memorial to Thomas placed in a garden chapel where only I had access. It wasn't much. Nobles couldn't publicly honor peasant farmers even when those peasants had unknowingly saved dynasties. But it was what I could do. In private memory of Thomas Blackwood, 1413 to 1450, farmer of good heart who gave his life unwillingly to serve a kingdom that gave him nothing but death in return. May he be remembered as a man of dignity who maintained kindness even when forced into terrible circumstances, and whose blood strengthened a royal line that never acknowledged his sacrifice. The historical records of this period are complicated by deliberate destruction of sensitive documents during the Wars of the Roses. King Henry VI's reign from 1422 to 1471 is extensively documented, including his periods of severe mental illness and physical weakness. Queen Margaret of Lancaster's marriage in 1445 and the birth of Prince Edward in 1451 are recorded in chronicles, with contemporary accounts noting the child's unusual size and robust health that differed markedly from Henry's frail constitution. Edward of Westminster's military career and death at Tewkesbury in 1471 are well-documented historical facts. The circumstances of his conception, however, remain deliberately obscured for centuries. Rumors about Edward's questionable parentage circulated during his lifetime, with York propagandists claiming he was illegitimate, but these were dismissed as political slander until much later. In 1923, historian Eleanor Ashford published The Secret Origins of Edward of Westminster, examining evidence including Margaret's private papers discovered during renovations of a French chateau she'd lived in during exile. These papers, authenticated by multiple scholars, detailed her forced arrangement with Thomas Blackwood and her complicated grief over his murder. The papers also documented Somerset's eugenic reasoning and the deliberate plan to strengthen Lancaster bloodline through introduction of robust common stock. The small memorial Margaret commissioned for Thomas was found during archaeological excavations in 1967 at what had been a Lancaster property. The inscription, partially worn but still readable, provided additional confirmation of the relationship and Thomas's fate. The discovery created significant academic debate but ultimately was accepted as credible based on multiple converging sources of evidence. The story has since been studied as an example of how dynastic necessity drove coerced reproduction across class boundaries, how common blood was deliberately introduced to strengthen weakened royal lines, and how individuals navigated the impossible moral situation of forced breeding arrangements with varying degrees of dignity and humanity. This is the story of Margaret of Lancaster and Thomas Blackwood, whose forced encounter created a prince who nearly won the Wars of the Roses, and whose survival of impossible circumstances demonstrates that dignity and kindness can persist even in coercion, that humanity can be maintained even when systematically attacked, and that people reduced to breeding instruments can still choose gentleness over cruelty and preserve essential humanity. Margaret was forced to conceive with a peasant she initially found revolting to save a dynasty she had no real power in. Thomas was murdered after giving life to a prince he'd never be allowed to know or claim. But together, despite the coercion and class hatred and complete wrongness of their situation, they created Edward of Westminster, a warrior prince who nearly changed English history and who carried both royal privilege and common strength precisely because of his mixed parentage. If this story moves you, if you believe that people forced into impossible situations deserve recognition for preserving dignity rather than condemnation for coerced compliance, if you believe that honest acknowledgement of class-based exploitation matters more than maintaining sanitized royal narratives, subscribe now to discover more hidden histories that challenge our assumptions about power, consent, class boundaries, and the complicated reality that positive outcomes never justify the methods used to achieve them when those methods involve coercion and violation. Leave a comment sharing what aspect of this story resonates with you. Was it Margaret's transformation from disgust to respect, Thomas's choice of gentleness despite knowing it would cost his life, or Edward's integration of both his royal and common heritage? Your engagement helps preserve these complex human stories that force us to confront uncomfortable questions about breeding, class exploitation, and the strange reality that strength sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, while the cost of obtaining that strength remains an injustice that should never be forgotten. Hit subscribe, share your thoughts, and join us in exploring the complicated truths behind royal dynasties and the real people who survived impossible choices while paying terrible prices.